Has Ulysses S. Grant's presidency been unfairly treated by history? Biographer Ron Chernow will be here to talk about his new book, Grant. When did New York become the city it is today? Historian Mike Wallace will join us to talk about Greater Gotham, his follow-up to the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Gotham. Alexander Alter will tell us about the latest goings-on in the literary world, and we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Ron Chernow joins us now. His latest biography is of Ulysses S. Grant. Thanks for being here, Ron.
Pleasure to be here.
How do you choose your subjects? Because you, of course, have written biographies of the Warburgs, of Hamilton, of Washington, and now Grant.
Well, I never want to write a biography about somebody just because it's an interesting yarn or even just because it's a fascinating life. I'm kind of looking at people whom I think have created the basic building blocks of American society. So I'm looking for characters who really embody a big trend, a big movement in American life. And so the attraction of Ulysses S. Grant for me was that he really is the figure who unites the Civil War and Reconstruction. To my mind, they're two acts of the same drama. And the interesting thing is, Pamela, there are so many Americans who know the Civil War in the most intimate details. They know every battlefield, every general, and they know little or next to nothing about Reconstruction. And if you don't know about Reconstruction, you know everything about the Civil War, you've walked out in the middle of the play. You really don't know how it ends because the South, after the war, really succeeded in reversing a lot of the gains of the war.
And similarly with Grant, people tend to focus on him as a general during the Civil War. And
you're absolutely right, because there have been other books by Grant, so people said, why, perpetrate another Grant biography? And what I noticed, not all of the Grant books, but a lot of them, 90% of the books would be about the 4 years of the Civil War. This is a man who led 9 lives. All 9 lives are equally important. And I particularly felt that the years of his presidency had been neglected and misunderstood, and that there was a caricature abroad that it was a failed presidency. It was marred by corruption, cronyism, and nepotism. All of those things happened, but I felt a much bigger story of his administration was his crusade to protect the 4 million former slaves, now fully fledged American citizens, to protect them against the wave of Ku Klux Klan violence that hit them after the Civil War. And I think that was perhaps the biggest of many misconceptions that I had to correct in doing the book.
You spoke on a panel about biography. I think this was after Titan, your John D. Rockefeller biography, came out, and you were with Blanche Wiesen-Cook and Robert Caro. And I think someone in the audience asked if you all liked your subjects and if you felt that you had to like your subject to work so long on a biography of that person.
It's a very good question. I think it's only fair to the subject that you start out with a presumption that you're going to like or admire the person. I think certainly if you start out disliking the person or even hating the person, it's going to have a very, very ugly tone, and it would have no interest for me spending several years with someone I dislike. Now, what I always say is that writing biography is a little bit like marriage, and you really don't know a great deal about your partner until you've been married
right.
for a year or two, and then it's kind of all, new. And so you can start out admiring the subject, and if you then turn out to, come up with a different view, that's fine. But I always feel that it's fair to at least start out by assuming that you're going to like this person. It's funny, after, Hamilton, people said to me, you should really do Thomas Jefferson. And I said, I don't feel that it's fair to Jefferson to inflict me on Jefferson. I guess I had, internalized all of Hamilton's
right.
prejudices against him.
So did you go into Grant liking and admiring him? And what led to that sort of positive?
I ended up, it's funny because people so often will say, did you end up liking this subject? And one thing that I've been saying to people for years is, I honestly don't think that way. I feel like I'm trying to do a portrait that will capture this person in as many dimensions as possible. And I would say, when a Rembrandt or a Titian or a Velázquez was doing a portrait, they weren't sitting there thinking, do I like this person or not? Funnily enough, having said that, I really ended up liking Grant, and I'll say that openly. There was something so fundamentally honest and decent and modest about this man. Also, this is very different from all of my biographies because I felt with all the other people that I wrote about, they had the fire in the belly. They had this vaulting ambition. You knew if they did not succeed at the thing they would succeed at, they would succeed at something. They had this drive, ambition, focus, enterprise. Grant is the first person that I've written about who is almost totally devoid of ambition. He does go to West Point, graduates in the middle of his class. His highest ambition after he leaves West Point is to be an assistant math professor. Not a math professor, but an assistant math professor. So this is someone who so not only transcends his beginnings, but so outdoes any conception that he has as his own life. You know, in Alexander Hamilton, or even George Washington, there are these great figures of history. John D. Rockefeller said when he started out as a teenage clerk on the Cleveland docks, he said, I was after something big, you know. Grant wasn't after something big. What happens is the Civil War breaks out. He's working as a clerk at his father's leather goods store in Galena. And there's one of these wonderful moments that can happen in a biography. Suddenly the figure meshes with his or her historical moment. And all of these hidden talents that Grant has suddenly begin to emerge in this story. And so he achieves glory. By the end of the war, he's general-in-chief, has 1 million soldiers under his command. But you never sense that he's thirsting for glory. Yes, he wants to succeed. But I found it a very touching story of a man who always felt that he was doing his duty. He was doing his job. He was doing what was right. And in the course of doing that, he achieved greatness. But, you know, like in Alexander Hamilton, in his early teens, the first letter we have from him, he writes to his friend John Lawrence, I wish there was a war so I could, prove, how great I am. Actually, he wrote it to his friend Ted Stevens. But whereas with Grant, he could easily have the Civil War never broken out. He would have had an obscure and forgettable life, and we wouldn't be sitting here talking about him.
Grant wrote what is widely considered to be the best memoir by a president and one of the best memoirs of all time. Was that sort of a hindrance or help in trying to capture him?
Well, funny you should ask that question, because I remember after I've been working on the biography for a couple of months, I ran into a friend who said to me, Ron, how do you write a great biography of someone who wrote a great autobiography? And I have to say I was reeling for a couple of days after that question. But then I realized a couple of things. Grant's memoir is not really an autobiography. He omits a couple of small things. There's no mention of his two-term presidency or the fact that he was acting Secretary of War, many, many things. It's really kind of military memoir. It covers his childhood, covers the Mexican War, and pretty much ends at the Civil War. But the question was very, very useful, even though it threw me at first, because it made me realize that what I'm doing as a biographer is I'm kind of looking at the very things that Grant does not want to talk about. So there's not one syllable about the drinking.
I was going to ask
problem.
about that.
Also, he went through this 2-3 year period in St. Louis where he was so broke. He was trying to support a wife and 4 children. He was selling firewood on the street corners in St. Louis. He was pawning his watch one Christmas to buy gifts for his family. When you get to that 2 or 3 year period, in the personal memoirs, Grant skips over it in a line or two. So in a certain way, that question helped me to define the agenda of my book, because I think with any biography, you don't have to be Sigmund Freud to realize that a lot of the important stuff will be in precisely those areas that this personality wants to avoid. And Grant, like all of us, was very chatty on certain topics and very, very, very secretive on others. And so it was my job as a biographer to delve into those secret corners of the life.
How self-aware was he? And you mentioned the alcoholism. How well is that captured in what he wrote about himself and what others wrote about him at the time?
I counted. I have more than 130-page references to alcoholism. So, when I started doing the book, my friend Harold Holzer, who's a great Lincoln scholar, Harold said to me, Ron, it would be nice to kind of settle this whole drinking thing once and for all, because there were a lot of people who said, oh, he's kind of hopeless, drinker. And then there were other people, who said the whole thing was overblown by his enemies and rivals. And I really like to think that I have solved it. The problem was this. There were a lot of people who worked very closely with him who said, I never saw Ulysses S. Grant touch a drop of alcohol. These were people who knew him very well and were very, very sincere. And yet there were other people who left, with these hair-raising descriptions of him when he was drunk. So how does the biographer reconcile that? Well, what I discovered was that there was a very, very consistent pattern of drinking. Grant was an alcoholic. If he had one drink, he couldn't stop. It would trigger personality change. But he did not drink every day. In fact, he was a binge drinker who would drink periodically. 2 or 3 months would go by. He would always wait until after a battle, and then he would take a side trip, and he would have a 2 or 3 day bender. He was what my friends in AA call a high-functioning alcoholic. He could almost schedule these binges, and he would schedule them at times when his soldiers and his staff would not see him. So it suddenly became understandable to me how a lot of people who thought that they knew him very well did not know about this secret recurring aspect of his life. And he never wrote about it, but I have quite a number of places in the book where he made comments about it to people. He said to one friend, if I take one drink, I can't stop. Says to another, colleague that it was the drinking issue that, forced him out of the army before the Civil War. I found that in terms of getting Grant to comment on it, I had to collect as many of these as were passing comments from people, and his wife Julia almost never talked about it. So I kind of like to think that I settled the mystery. The readers will have to decide. Before
we get into Grant's life in more detail, I have to talk a little bit about something that must have interrupted your writing.
A little bit.
Which was Hamilton. What was that like to have that happen in the middle of working on this?
Well, believe it or not, the entire writing of Grant took place after Hamilton opened. And I was a member of the creative team, particularly in the early months at the Public Theater downtown Manhattan. Lynn was still rewriting the show. He wanted us all to, see it like every third night. So I saw it dozens of times. And so I kept saying to friends for a very long time, I said, I have 2 full-time jobs because I was writing Grant weekdays, mornings and afternoons. And then very often I was at the theater, nights and weekends. And then I think after Lynn, who did far and away the most number of interviews and appearances, I probably did the second most. I probably did 100 interviews or appearances or speeches related to the show. So Hamilton was a full-time job. I don't know how on earth I managed to do it. But I think what it was is that the show, it was so inspiring. It was so energizing. We actually had the experience of seeing, the book and seeing the musical changing people's views and changing people's lives. People would come up to me in the theater and say, this book or this musical just changed my life.
You mentioned earlier that one of the things that you admired most about Grant is his honesty. But if you had to kind of crystallize what it is about Grant's character that makes him interesting.
Oh, this kind of, dogged, persevering character, because I think that he went through more adversity and more failure in the years before the Civil War than anyone else who went on to become president. We really see him, hit bottom here. He's drummed out of the army because of drinking charges.
And what year is this?
1854, and his friends find him holed up in this cheap miner's hotel. He doesn't have the money to get back to the East Coast to see his wife and family. They're terrible scenes. He then has to leave his family, move into the back room with this couple in St. Louis. He's trying to make a go of it in this real estate business, and he's terrible. He was terrible at every business that he tried, but he is dogged and persevering. And I think that what happens, the Civil War breaks out.
What do you think it was that drove him when you say that he was dogged and perseverance? Because it wasn't ambition.
This is something that he seems to have had from the time that he was a child, this kind of, stick-to-itness. He never turned back. It was a powerful superstition with him. Everyone noticed it in wartime. There was no turning back. But I uncovered one really interesting story. After he was president, he and Julia Grant made this round-the-world trip, and they went up to a jewelry store that was on the second floor of a shop in Paris, and they were walking down the stairs, and Julia turned to Ulysses and said, that butterfly brooch, I want to go back and get it. And Grant said, oh, no, we can't turn back. I mean, it was really, literally a superstition with him. And then I think he got it for her later on. But he seems to have had that kind of not turning back and sticking to it quality from the beginning. And people who observed him as a boy, even his mother said he was very serious about things. And he had, from the time he was a child, and he was working from the time that he was a child, he had a very business-like approach to things in terms of getting a job done.
I want to go past the Mexican War and the Civil War period and jump ahead to Reconstruction, because you mentioned that this is one of the periods that is kind of overlooked. What was Grant's role in Reconstruction, his approach to it, and in particular to the fate of African Americans in the South?
Well, he was in many ways the most important figure, because what happens between the end of the Civil War, 1865, and Grant's presidency in 1869, he still is general-in-chief. And the significance of that is that, the radical Republicans in Congress carve up the South into 5 military districts. So the South is occupied. And there are these 5 military commanders reporting not to the president, but reporting to U.S. Grant. So he's really kind of like the czar of the South in the way. Grant was the single most important figure behind the 15th Amendment that gave black males the right to vote. So he was the first president who had to deal with the Southern white backlash to black voting rights from the 15th Amendment. This was no small thing. There were states like Mississippi and South Carolina where blacks constituted the majority of the population, which meant that if blacks really exercised the suffrage, that blacks were going to control many of the southern states. And this is when the Klan violence started. And the Klan violence was directed against blacks registering voting. And that's where Grant is most important in terms of he brought 3,000 indictments against the Ku Klux Klan at a time when no Southern sheriff would arrest a member of the Klan, no Southern jury would convict.
Did this come out of personal conviction on his part?
I think it did. Grant, by his own admission, did not start out as a big abolitionist. In fact, I spent a lot of time in the book talking about the fact that the Grants were an abolitionist family from southwestern Ohio. He marries into a slave-owning family, the Dents of St. Louis. So he's caught in his own Civil War. He always disliked slavery. In fact, during those years of farming in St. Louis, he got as a gift, I think from Julia's father, a slave, and he manumitted the slave. This was in 1858, at a time when Grant really used the money, and someone else, might have slaved or rented out the slave. But what happens during the Civil War is fascinating because he's fiercely patriotic. He feels deeply that what the South is doing, seceding, is treason. So he supports the original aim of the war, which was to preserve the Union. Then one of the reasons he does so well with Lincoln and in the war is not just that he was a great general, but he comes to believe deeply in emancipation. And like a lot of the Union generals, he wondered at first, could black soldiers make good soldiers? Did they have the discipline? All of this stuff. But Grant was a very honest man. And as soon as he saw black soldiers fighting in a place called Milliken's Bend in 1863, he realized that they were wonderful soldiers. And in fact, they were very highly motivated in a war, against the slave empire. And so I think a lot of it was Grant just honestly observing black. He was a man completely devoid of any racial prejudice. I hate to tell you, Sheridan and Sherman's, I hate to tell you some of the names that they throw around in their letters. You would never see the N-word, for instance, in a letter by Ulysses S. Grant. And he became, Frederick Douglass said, the Negro owes his enfranchisement to Ulysses S. Grant more than any one man. Douglass said, Grant is the vigilant, firm, wise, and impartial protector of our race. What he did for African Americans as president, aside from protecting them in the South, was extraordinary. Frederick Douglass in the 1872 election counted 250 blacks that Grant had appointed in a single department in Washington. Grant did all these things.
And the first black diplomat.
First black diplomat. Also, every New Year's used to be a big tradition. Throw open the doors of the White House, people would come in. Grant insisted that blacks enter, alongside whites. His 1872 inaugural ball, he invited blacks. There were a number of whites who boycotted the inaugural ball because they refused to be there with blacks. So he did all these things. And I mention him because, we always hear about Teddy Roosevelt invited, Booker T. Washington to dinner in the White House. And that was a big deal. You'll see plenty in the book how many black delegations came to the White House. Just Grant incorporated blacks into so many things during his presidency. But I feel like so many things that happened in his presidency and during Reconstruction, there's like this historical amnesia. People don't know there was a civil rights movement in this country in the late 1860s, early 1870s.
Well, and the presidency, two-term presidency of Grant also, the high school version of it is Gilded Age, graft, corruption.
Yeah.
Has his presidency been unfairly maligned, or his role in that presidency?
I think so. I spent a lot of time in the book talking about the scandals. I never want, a reader or a reviewer to say, well, of course, Chernow admires Grant. He didn't talk about all those scandals. I do. I'd make the point Grant himself was never personally involved or implicated in any of them. His major weakness, not just as president, but in many ways as a person, was that he could be incurably naive about people. He was a sucker of con men his entire life. In that way, he could be very shrewd about a lot of different things, but there was also a simplicity to his nature. And from the time that he was a young man, to the time he died, he was blind to people who manipulated him and had designs upon him. And so, most notorious of the scandals under Grant, the whiskey scandals, the chief culprit turned out to be Orville Babcock, who was his most confidential aide. Today we would call Orville Babcock his chief of staff. It was not a term that was used at the time. But he was the one who was literally in Grant's outer office and going through his mail, and everything else. And Grant was repeatedly warned that Orville Babcock was involved in the whiskey scandal, and it took Grant really 6 months, a year to finally see the light.
You mentioned earlier that Grant was a person who sort of met his moment in history that brought this out in him. And in his review of your book, on the cover of the book review this week, President Bill Clinton sees your biography in a similar way. And I'm going to quote from his review from the opening. He says, "This is a good time for Ron Chernow's fine biography of Ulysses S. Grant to appear, as we live with the reality of Faulkner's declaration, the past is never dead, it's not even past. We are now several years into revisiting the issues that shaped Grant's service in the Civil War and the White House, from the rise of white supremacy groups to successful attacks on the right of eligible citizens to vote, to the economic inequalities of the Gilded Age. In so many ways, Grant comes to us now as much a mirror as a history lesson." Do you see parallels between Grant's moment and our own?
I agree with Bill Clinton. I don't think that it's at all coincidental that we're going through this controversy about the Confederate monuments, because there still is all of this unfinished business from the Civil War. I wrote about the Revolutionary War and Constitutional Convention, forging the federal government. Those were all unifying experiences in American life. The Civil War was the most polarizing, most divisive thing that ever happened, and it continues to divide us and continues to affect American politics because there are two competing stories. Every reputable historian will tell you that the Civil War was about slavery. There was no disagreement about that at the time. But then what happened was, still in a lot of Southern schools, they're taught that it's about states' rights, and that also after the Civil War, there was a whole school of thought, the Lost Cause school, that began to glorify the South, and part of that glorification was the glorification of Robert E. Lee, and that Lee was the great general, and he was this perfect Christian gentleman, and he embodied all of these aristocratic traits. And in lifting Lee up, part of that was building all these monuments, and also was kind of saying to the Black South, Reconstruction is over, the white man is back in charge. And part of that glorification of Lee was tearing down Grant. But I think that, the basis of, so much of what's going on in terms of this controversy is that there still are two competing narratives. And, politics, at the end of the day, it all boils down to the stories that we tell ourselves about our past. Because as Faulkner said, and as Bill Clinton quotes in the review, the past is never really past. And I think that if you've never really sort of dealt with something historically, as I feel that we still have not fully dealt with Civil War and Reconstruction, it keeps bursting back. It's like, shrink will say you keep trying to suppress something in the unconscious. It'll keep periodically, rising up. And I feel like, the Civil War and Reconstruction, it's like all these demons in the American subconscious that keep periodically bursting to the surface because we never dealt with them.
This book is feeling more like opera than hip-hop musical to me. I don't know about you.
I have hope that it will be a feature film. It's not going to be a hip-hop musical. Grant's life does not move to a hip-hop beat, nor does...
Well, that's what you thought the first time.
I know
the last
that Lynn
time.
does not want his next show to be American history, and I think he's probably right about that. I think Hamilton will do for a while.
Okay, well, for now, we can all content ourselves with the book. The title is Grant. It's by Ron Chernow. Ron, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, this has been a great pleasure. Thank you, Pamela.
Mike Wallace joins us now. He is a distinguished professor of history at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. His previous book, Gotham, A History of New York City to 1898, won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1999. His new book is a continuation of that project called Greater Gotham, A History of New York City from 1898 to 1919. Mike, thanks so much for being here.
A pleasure.
So let's start with the original project of Gotham, which you co-wrote with Edwin Burroughs. How did you come to that project, and did you know that it would be multi-volume when you started?
We had committed ourselves to an even more preposterous project, in fact, which was to write the entire history of the U.S. of A. in the same manner as a narrative with zillions of people in it and stories. And for that project, a massive footnote apparatus as well. That itself was coming out of what I would argue is a generational transformation in the historiography of the United States. I came to the profession in the 1960s as a student at Columbia, and in those days, the 50s image of American history was remarkably benign and narrow. There were virtually no blacks in the story. There was George Washington Carver, who did something with peanuts. There were the slaves, but they were happy. Women were notable for their absence. There was Betsy Ross sewing the American flag, but not a lot else.
Dolly Madison and the ice cream.
That's it. That's right. Then the benignant view of American foreign policy was we were an unmitigated force for good. Then came the civil rights movement, and then came the women's movement, and then came the gay movement, and then came the anti-war movement, which roiled the 60s and the 70s. And this was basically people demanding inclusion to the American present. And I was involved with a group of historians who set out to bring those same social groups into the historical American narrative where they had not been. And this was spurred for me. I was a very cautious person politically. My mother had always told me that J. Edgar Hoover was watching my every move. She wasn't far wrong, as it turned out. And so I was a careful lad. But 1968 at Columbia was a dramatic year. I was involved in the student movement and banded together with a group of historians coming out of Columbia, out of Harvard, out of Yale, of the University of Wisconsin, who set out to rewrite the history of the United States. This was done piecemeal, so blacks were included in the narrative, but not simply as a matter of addition, because once you had them in the story, you had racism in the story, and you had the contradiction between Declaration of Independence and the reality of slavery. Women are discovered, oops, we left half the population out of the picture, and with their inclusion comes sexism, gender analysis, domesticity, a whole raft of things that were opened up by their presence. So what happened was that in tandem with these social movements, there was an historical movement. And I was right in the middle of it because I had set up an organization with colleagues to further this effort. We published a journal called the Radical History Review. I could see after 10 years or so that we had, in fact, collectively rewritten the history of the United States, but virtually nobody knew it because all of these were done piecemeal, and what was lacking was a narrative overview that stitched all of these pieces together and made them accessible to a general public. And I set out to write this book, and I enlisted Ted's work. We had co-committed, of course, verbose, lengthy article on the history of the American Revolution. And we spent several years on this project, and we had written many hundreds of pages, and we hadn't gotten out of the 17th century. Partly this was because we were setting it in a global context. We were looking at the expansion of European imperialism, the transition from feudalism to capitalism, these giant global phenomena, which I still think are the essential context for understanding what happened in the United States to be. So, unfortunately, we realized this would take about 11 lifetimes, and we only had 2 to spare. So after another year being depressed, I thought, well, let's decant all of this into something more manageable. Only the history of one city. Yes, it's New York, and it's a big deal and all that, but the trick was going to be to make use of all of the world and national history that we constructed and set New York City in this larger context. And out of that came Gotham.
And you start that history in 1524. How many years did you cover in that book, which was, I think, also over 1,000 pages like this one?
Yes, alas, something in the 1,400 range. Yeah, 300 some odd years.
And how did you choose 1898 as the end point? Was it exhaustion, or was there a logical ending there?
Exhaustion played a role. The limits of bindery technology were important. The claim on readers' patience was perhaps being pressed too far. But also it was a strategically important moment in the history of the city. It wasn't quite as strategically important as 1919 was, when arguably New York City challenges London for the position of the center of the capitalist and global order. It was a lesser moment, but still a critical one. It was the merger of the major cities grouped around the harbor.
So this was the 5 boroughs came to be.
This is when the 5 boroughs came to be. So it was an appropriate ending point, and it was an even more appropriate beginning point for the story of only 20-some-odd years.
I want to get to that point, and I know it's the end point, but of 1919, why is that the year? Obviously, we're at the end of World War I, a little after. Why is that the year when New York City really threatens London as the global capital?
New York and the United States were industrial superpowers at the beginning of this period. That was the legacy of the 19th century. But financially and in terms of credit standing, it was a debtor third world nation. We went into that war owing the British, the French, the Germans, the Europeans roughly $4 billion, and this was when a billion was a billion. The Europeans started killing each other, and the demands of industrial warfare are gigantic, stupendous. So they start buying from the US of A, and New York becomes the brokerage point, J.P. Morgan in particular. And they go through all their gold supply. It's still the gold standard days. So one shipped bullion across the Atlantic. So it shifted. Then they ran out of gold. So then they started selling off their stocks, and they sold them all off. And that was good for a bit, but they still needed more gas, more gas masks, more gas, more barbed wire for the trenches, et cetera, et cetera. So they started borrowing money from the same people to whom they had been loaning money for the previous period. At the end of that war, they are $4 billion in hock to the U.S. It's a complete and total reversal. And New York is in a position, while Britain is on its back, to begin moving into territories, Latin America, Asia, Africa, where European capital had been dispensed to develop mines, railroads, et cetera, et cetera. And they moved quickly, and they knew what was going on, and so did the British, who were desperately alarmed, but had no choice in the matter. So at the end of the war, I mean, Britain is in terrible shape, but Britain still has the empire and Britain still has the navy. So they're not down and out. And in the 20s and the 30s, there was a ongoing rivalry. And it was only at the end of the Second War, which all goes well, will be the ending point of the third volume. That was a critical moment. And given that of the various altitudes at which I survey the history of the city, the uppermost one, satellite side view, is looking at the city's changing position on the planet. I don't mean that it skitters around. It started off as Lenape country, then it became a pissant little backwater of the Dutch Empire, then it became an important provincial port in the burgeoning English Empire, then for a scant minute or two until Alexander Hamilton sold us down the river, the Potomac River. It was the capital of the USA. Then it was the critical interlink between European capital and labor flowing into the development of the North American agricultural hinterland. Then after the Civil War, the U.S. becomes an industrial power centered in its management in New York City. And then in 1919, it becomes a contender for capital of the world, which is then, in fact, secured in 1945.
How did you balance, obviously, especially with New York, when thinking about American history, you're talking about financial history, economic history. How did you balance in both of these books the economic history with political and social and cultural? And is there one that you sort of consider to be your personal interest and focus? I mean, obviously, they're interrelated.
It's no cute trick. History is done in the academic world in grooves. There are the economic historians, the architectural historians, the immigration historians. Everything's got its own track. This is a practical working necessity, and you can develop arcane languages, but which are useful in probing the issues that are involved in that particular trajectory. But it's not the way real life happens. Real life happens all at once. How to convey the fruits of the labor in these umpteen different vineyards. The people who can do this best are those like my wife, Carmen Bujosa, one of Mexico's foremost writers, is to write novels. Novelists convey everything simultaneously, how things look, how they smell, how they feel, how they touch, the context, the close-ups, etc. So what I've opted to do is to get as close to being a novel as possible and to tell stories that embody all of these things at the same time. At the same time, there are areas of attention that indeed, as you say, are architectural, cultural, economic, financial, political, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And it's a work of serious scholarship at the same time that you're trying to reach a general audience and have it be accessible. I'm assuming that's a lot of stripping out of academic jargon.
Virtually none.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a separable concern because when I was working with the radical historians and redoing things, I was also working with museums, with filmmakers. I worked with Rick Burns on a 14-hour enterprise. I write critiques of museum exhibitions, write critiques of historical movies, of historical novels. I've collected a lot of these in a book called Mickey Mouse History because I also analyzed history messages that were implicit in Disney World or not so implicit. Or Colonial Williamsburg, which was, again, it was a political battlefield. Colonial Williamsburg said this is the sacred spot where Jefferson trod the earth. And then the African-American community coming into the precinct say, where's the black people? And given that 50% of the population were black slaves, this was an explosive question. And a generation of public historians, people who worked specifically in thinking of how to access larger general audiences, redid Colonial Williamsburg.
Was there a particular period or event that you were especially eager to write about in this volume?
It wasn't an event so much, although there were plenty of events that regarded it, but a transformation or the development at the beginning of a transformation of attitudes towards what we would now call multiculturalism or multinationalism. New York wasn't unique in this, but in the phenomena, but it was in its scale, which is immigration. And this period is a colossal wave of immigration, continuing the Irish and the German movements, but overwhelming the Italians and Jewish and African Americans from the Caribbean and the South and so forth.
Give us a sense of the scale of that.
The city goes from, well, it's a little tricky because there's the merger involved, but from 1.5 million in 1898 to 5.6 million in 1919. Mm-hmm. And they don't come in drips and drops. They come in enormous flow, and they don't disaggregate once they arrive and move to the suburbs. They conglomerate in giant enclaves. Now, this had happened before. But the reputation of enclaves was sort of bad. I mean, when Dickens came to town in the 19th century, they gave him a police escort to go visit the 5 Points. Mm-hmm. Now, the guidebooks of this period, the tourist industry is born in a big way in this period. Guidebooks start boasting about New York's cosmopolitanism. Mm-hmm. Ancient Rome had nothing on New York, We've got representatives of every nation on earth here. More penetratingly, there were people, philosophers, journalists, John Dewey, Horace Callan, and particularly Randolph Bourne, who argued that something of world historical importance had been established here in the U.S. and New York City in particular. The possibility of people from wildly diverse cultures living not lovey-dovey, mm-hmm. But more or less getting along. And these were cultural strongholds. They were big enough so that you could maintain the native language, newspapers, theatrical performances, styles of dress, and the rest of it. So it was a dizzying sense of variety. But to understand what they were doing is that they were contesting an intellectual and cultural political phenomena, which was called eugenics. There were people, particularly the Anglo-Protestant community, who saw themselves as primacy of place in New York by right of cultural primogeniture. We were here first, and you can come, but, you mold yourself, you meld yourself into looking like us. Mm-hmm. Language, costume, food, everything. And some went farther than that. It's not just that we were going to coerce them into becoming Americans, which was a code name for us, the Anglos, but that these newcomers, in fact, were incapable of becoming proper Americans biologically. That people who were poor were the victims of bad genes, and people who were radicals were distinctly problematic on genetic grounds. What to do with them? Well, the more dramatic responses was to sterilize them. Euthanasia was discussed as a possibility. Mm-hmm. We could end crime, we could end radicalism by drastic measures, or the fallback preferred position was immigration restriction. So what you get in this period is a all too familiar battle over immigration. People like Madison Grant, who writes a book called The Passing of the Great Race in 1916, is picked up by one Adolf Hitler in his prison cell, who writes Grant that this is his Bible. And when Hitler came to power in 1933, the first book that he ordered, translated and mass reproduced, was Madison Grant's Passing of the Great Race, a dirge for the collapse of white supremacy.
Final question, and it's a trick one because it's a two-part question. But how did you choose and where did you choose to end a volume like this? What scene or what incident? And do you know already how you want to start the next volume?
The first part is relatively easy because there's this dramatic multiple exclamation point event that in effect brings to a close what's known as the Red Scare. After the end of the First World War, during which Wilson and the federal government had made some concessions to labor, guaranteeing them the right to organize, among other things, and setting up minimum wages and setting up working condition regulations and all that. At the end of the war, the government drops all of these programs and leads to naked class conflict between capitalists who are determined to regain managerial autonomy and the workers who had seen their salaries go up only one step ahead of the surging inflation that's caused by the war. And 1919 is war. There are hundreds of strikes that take place in New York. And there is a side kick to this operation, which is coming out of the anarchist movement, which is in a fury at capitalist use of violence, hired guns and suppression and so forth. And they launch a subterranean bombing campaign, which is pretty inept for the most part, until 1920, when things had begun to settle down. And one guy, member of one of the most radical Italian anarchist groups, the Gallianisti, pulls up in front of the strategic spot in front of the New York Stock Exchange, across the street from J.P. Morgan, next to the Federal Hall, which was then the sub-treasury, and bullion stacked up inside it all, and sets off a gigantic bomb, which kills scores of people, all of them innocent passerbys. Morgan Jr. was not even in the country at the time. And what's fascinating is that although there were people in the federal government and the city economy who wanted to now reopen this war, which had settled down, even this monstrous action couldn't reverse the tide, which had already washed Warren G. Harding into the White House and amid calls for normalcy.
So you end the book, as we said, in 1919, and you alluded to the fact that there will be a third volume. Is that going to start in 1919 or 1920? And do you know the sort of that opening scene?
I don't have an opening scene. I've got lots of candidates for it. The question is, how much does it pick up on where things left off? One of the organizing principles of this book at a lower level than global position in relation to country is the so-called business cycle, the ups and downs of boom, bust, usually boom, bust, war, boom, bust, war. And the 20s begins with a depression.
Right.
And it's a short one. And one possibility is to deal with the returning veterans, finding, among other things, prohibition has been set in place. The women can now vote. The world is poised on major confrontation. And also, Wall Street is involved with the possibility of refinancing European devastated economy so that U.S. can have relations with them again. It's a very complicated moment, and to decide which piece of it to launch the enterprise on is tricky, and it's a writing issue, and I'm not at the point. But I am at the point of saying, quickly as possible, boom time again, just like this volume begins with coming out of the 1890s depression, which was a terrible one. It was called the Great Depression. But I enter dramatically into the surge of prosperity. So somehow or another, that surge is going to be emotionally, dynamically the trigger point.
All right. Well, we will look forward to Volume 3. And in the meantime, of course, we have a very substantive, beautiful Volume 2, Greater Gotham, A History of New York City from 1898 to 1919, to keep us busy until then. Mike, thanks so much for being here.
Pleasure.
Mike Wallace is the author of Gotham, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1999, and its sequel, now out, Greater Gotham. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
Who are we going to talk about this week?
Today, we're going to talk about the young adult author John Green, who finally published a new novel. His fans had been waiting for years, since The Fault in Our Stars came out in 2012. And it's an incredibly moving novel, and one that is very, very personal to him. It deals with anxiety and obsessive-compulsive disorder in a really interesting and moving way. And it's something that he has struggled with in his own life, which he's been talking about now that he's out doing interviews about the book.
So for those who are uninitiated in the phenomenon that is John Green, I mean, I remember when The Fault in Our Stars came out, when it was announced, and this was 2012, just the announcement, it went #1 on Amazon.
Exactly. It
Months
stayed there
before.
for weeks. I mean, he has millions of fans. He has this really interesting audience. He and his brother Hank Green have this YouTube empire. They have 16 shows that they produce, and he appears in a couple of them. So they have millions of online fans. And some of that audience has translated into his reading audience. But that is actually, I think, outgrown even his YouTube audience. So
this is the vlogging that he does.
Exactly. Video blogging and some educational shows that he does. But his book audience has vastly outpaced that now. I mean, he draws in a lot of adult readers, obviously. His books have collectively more than 50 million copies in print around the world. So that's massive. And The Fault in Our Stars alone has more than 23 million copies in print. And of course, that's been boosted by some of the film adaptations that have been done of his books. But he's really a powerhouse. And I think he's had a profound effect on children's literature and young adult literature in particular. He has a kind of idiosyncratic way of writing where he has these really clever teen protagonists who are very smart and very sensitive. And I think our book critic, Jennifer Senior, described the dialogue in his books as being kind of Aaron Sorkin-esque. They're very quick-witted and, they're realistic. He deals with a lot of really weighty issues. I mean, in The Fault in Our Stars, the issue was teenagers with cancer who fall in love. And his books are often very emotionally devastating, but almost never maudlin. So the thing that really stands out about this new novel, which is called Turtles All the Way Down, is that it's even, I think it's even darker in some ways and kind of relentless in its darkness because the protagonist is a 16-year-old girl named Asa Holmes, and she has a very severe anxiety disorder. And because she's the narrator of the book, it really exposes readers to kind of the relentlessness of these thought cycles that she gets caught up in when she starts thinking she might have this intestinal bacteria that's going to kill her. She starts thinking that her finger is infected and she really needs to check on it and drain the wound. And you can see sort of how that is built into her daily life in a way that, what people who don't sort of experience this might think, well, just, think happy thoughts or be positive.
Right.
You really, because she's narrating the novel, you can see how ingrained it is.
You can hear the emotion in your voice there. And I remember the day after you read this book, which you got an early copy of, you came in and were just like, it is really, really good.
Yeah, I was really struck by this novel. I don't think I've read a book that made that kind of experience of mental illness kind of palpable in that way. And speaking to John Green about it, he struggled with this his whole life, and he's spoken about it on his YouTube videos and addressed it in interviews before, but, he'd never really taken it head on in fiction. And right before he started working on this book, he had a period of several months where he had kind of fallen prey to obsessive kind of thought cycles that he sometimes experiences. And it, prevented him from writing anything. He couldn't even really read anything or watch television. And when he came out of that, once he sort of recovered, he felt like this was the only subject that he could possibly write about. And I think it's going to have a real impact for readers because there was an interesting article that's going to be in the Times Magazine this Sunday about anxiety disorders among teenagers and how they seem to be spiking. It's kind of outpaced depression as a real problem for young people. And that might be due to better diagnoses of it or, there's no real one cause to pinpoint, but it's definitely something that people are concerned about and talking about. And I think for a popular author like John Green, who is so successful and kind of visible to talk about his experience with it and then to write about it in a way that people can really understand it, I think will have a huge effect.
I thought one of the most interesting things about your profile and reading about what he's gone through is the fact that he went through this again, that he had a relapse right after The Fault in Our Stars, trying to figure out sort of how to come back from that, how to write after you have a novel that is such a huge success.
Yeah. I mean, that was a career-changing novel for him. It was, like I said, it sold millions of copies around the world and made him kind of not just famous in his little enclave on the internet, but kind of, famous.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that caused a lot of pressure and anxiety for him.
And this is the second time you've interviewed John, right? You interviewed him once for the Wall Street Journal where you worked before this time.
And that was interesting because that was when the Fault in Our Stars movie was coming out. And so he was really just kind of on the map for general readers, kind of breaking into the mainstream. And when I did that piece, I went to see him where he lives in Indianapolis and toured their studio where they make all their shows, and kind of got a window into how he balances his writing career and his YouTube career, which he considers to be his day job. The writing is sort of something that he does on the side. And this was something that was hard for him to do and hard for him to talk about. And that was obvious even when I went to this fan event that he had in Manhattan on Monday for Turtles All the Way Down. He read from the book and he kind of drew the parallels to his own life. And it was obviously a difficult thing for him to address. But I think he feels like it's important, and he wants to kind of reduce any sense of stigma surrounding mental illness, any sense of embarrassment that people might have talking about it. So he's trying to be as open as he can.
All right. So the novel, again, for teenage readers and for grown-ups is Turtles All the Way Down. Alexandra, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Coles, John Williams, and Luvia Gayarke. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
All right, let's start with John. What are you reading this week?
I feel like I'm started with more often than not. I read 3 things that I'll get through quickly this week. I finished The Lost Weekend by Charles Jackson, which I brought up last week. And the reason I bring it up again is because I was enjoying it. I was about halfway through. But I have to say in finishing it that it's really a classic book. It has a lot of integrity in terms of what it does, which is just... It's a very focused portrait of this one guy going through alcoholic withdrawal and also indulging in his alcoholism. But the writing is just incredibly crisp. It's psychologically acute, and I would highly, highly recommend it. I think that the movie by Billy Wilder has kind of taken over the title in people's imaginations, but I think the novel is definitely worth rediscovering. Then I, like the obit read, I did the Nobel read because Kazuo Ishiguro was awarded the Nobel Prize last week, and I had never read him, actually. So
What a treat. What a treat. How lucky.
Well, I know. I read Never Let Me Go, and I have to say that I was not... I know that you and Radhika are huge fans, and so I feel... But I was kind of bored with it, and I don't know why. It felt...
Had you seen the movie?
I haven't seen the movie. Is the movie really good?
No.
I love Saoirse Ronan. I think I'm going to keep reading him because I haven't read The Remains of the Day, which obviously I think I should read. And I know people who like others of his books. So I think maybe I just need to get into sort of his tone. But I found it kind of unaffected in a way that felt a little too flat to me. Anyway, he doesn't need my help, but I feel bad that I'm not like a super fan right out of the gate. And then lastly, I'm reading a recent novel called New People by Danzy Senna.
This came out in August.
It did, and it got a decent amount of attention then, and I've had several people, including Lovia, who's sitting here to my left, recommend it. And Parl Sagal, too, who reviewed it for I think it was maybe her first review as a Daily Critic.
Yes.
And she also enjoyed it.
Jen Salai and I have both talked about this book, too, and what we're reading.
Lovia and Par like it. So, they take that very seriously. And it's set in it's called New People. It's a novel by Danzy Senna, Senna. And it's about a couple who are each biracial, and they meet in college in the 90s, and then they go on to, at the point I'm at, about 2/3 of the way through, they're engaged to be married. But the woman in the couple is sort of has a wandering eye. She's interested in this poet in the neighborhood who she wants to have an affair with. And it's very redolent. I went to college in the 1990s at a place that was much less, it was in Texas. It was a liberal arts college, but it didn't have the kind of, this is where identity politics was first sort of becoming a burgeoning thing among young people. And it's very interesting to see it. I think she recaptures it really well. And especially given like the current moment, it's interesting to go back and see sort of some of the germinal pieces of that culturally. And she's a very lively and funny writer. And the book kind of breezes by. It's fairly short to begin with. And it's written in a fairly conversational style. So I'm going quickly.
All right, over to
speaking of to my left.
Yeah. So I'm reading 2 books right now. I started with Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Garden, which is a nonfiction, her book of essays. And it's just like 35 essays that she'd written over the course of her life.
When did this book come out?
The book came out in 1983.
Wow.
And then I'm also reading Sing Unburied Sing by Jesmyn Ward, which we just reviewed twice. Parul did a review, which was beautiful. And then Tracy K. Smith also did a review, which was equally beautiful. I feel like I'm just preaching to the choir here. This book is excellent.
Have you read her previous books?
Yeah. Salvage the Bones made me cry. And
That's always the definition of a good book.
Yeah. Like at the end, I was broken. And this book is leaving me equally broken. I think she just has, just beautiful writing. And it was sort of hard to get into, actually, a little bit, because I just finished New People, which is sort of a breeze. But now it's picking up, and I'm really enjoying it. It was really funny. I was telling John yesterday and Greg earlier is that in her By the Book, Jesmyn Ward, cites In Search of Our Mother's Garden as the best gift that she's ever received. And she said that in 1999, it was battered when her father gave it to her. And now it's even more battered. And so I thought it was sort of a nice coincidence that I started with this book and I'm now reading this book.
Yours looks pretty battered.
Yeah,
so I enjoying it in that kind of way.
It's true. I love Alice Walker, and I've read some of the essays a couple times in this book, but have.
And you said you were already reading the Alice Walker when you came across the By the Book.
Yes,
so,
yeah. So
nice
really
coincidence.
I know, it's nice, and they pair quite nicely, actually. And because they're both, Southern writers and have this infatuation, but also, I don't want to say disdain, though Alice Walker definitely had a disdain for Mississippi. And she had an essay about how much she hated it and then left, but also felt like it was her, creative apex.
What are most of the essays in the Walker about?
So they're a combination of reviews and personal essays about her family and her identity and being a writer. And they're actually arranged in a really interesting format. So it starts with an essay about finding a mentor and finding idols or sort of people to look up to sort of in the writing world, and how she came to realize that even though, she liked Flannery O'Connor and, a bunch of sort of white writers from the South, that she could never really relate to them. Then the essay sort of moved through her coming to understanding of herself as a writer. And I just finished the title essay, actually, In Search of Our Mother's Garden, where she feels much more like a fully evolved person. And she talks about thinking about how women before her, starting with Phyllis Wheatley, how they become writers and artists, even though they were sort of repressed in the way both in terms of slavery and also just in terms of domestic life. So they're very personal. She talks a lot about her father and a lot about the South as a landscape for inspiration, but also repression.
All right, Greg, you've got a podcast to read there, and that you're reading Jennifer Egan, who was on the podcast last week.
I am reading Jennifer Egan. So I'll talk about the other book first, just very quickly, because our review of it has not appeared yet, but the book is just out, and I really enjoyed it. So I'll mention it. It's a novel named The Power by Naomi Alderman. It's her fourth novel, and she's gotten quite a lot of attention in Britain, where she's from. She won the Orange Prize for fiction and for an earlier novel. And she was one of Granta's best young British novelists. In America, she might be best known as a video game creator, as an app writer. She wrote the very popular app Zombies Run. She also wrote
which she didn't win the Orange Prize.
She also wrote the app The Walk. So she's been involved in various best-selling iPhone apps.
This is like a feminist science fiction novel?
This is, she. Do you know about the Rolex Mentor Program? Rolex, the watch company, pairs young artists across various fields with very established artists. They've done it with
Did you get a Rolex in the process?
You might. I don't know. But Naomi Alderman took part of this as a protege, and her mentor was Margaret Atwood. And this novel is very much in the Margaret Atwood vein. It is speculative fiction. It is very feminist. And the premise of it, again, I'll just say quickly because our review is coming up later this month, is that over time, women develop the power to generate electricity through their bodies, and they can discharge this electricity fatally. I mean, they can use their bodies as a deadly weapon.
Pass me that book.
It's not a how-to book.
And over the course, very quickly in the book is set really thousands of years in the future. But the change happens very quickly, where once women develop this power, it becomes a matriarchal society. Women, as they become physically dangerous, are able to seize control of society, or to gain control. It's not like there's a revolution that they seize control, but power starts ceding to women once they become physically dangerous. And so it looks at kind of a matriarchal society.
Wow, I've got to read this.
Yeah, we'll have to wait about 1,000 years for it to be effective for us. But
Not to be too dark, but I feel like any books set thousands of years in the future is kind of optimistic right now. So what about the
I know, will we make it?
So yes, Pamela's right. I am also reading Jennifer Egan, and our listeners probably know that she has a new novel out, Manhattan Beach. That's not the novel that I'm reading. I did read Manhattan Beach, and I quite enjoyed it. But Egan was profiled in the most recent New Yorker by Alexandra Schwartz. And she talks, in the course of that profile, she goes back and looks at earlier novels, including the only Jennifer Egan novel that I had never read, which is called Look at Me. It was her second novel. I had followed Jennifer Egan since early in her career. I really loved her debut book, which was a story collection called Emerald City. And her first novel then I read after that was The Invisible Circus, which was a novel about a couple of sisters. Then this novel, Look at Me, came out right after 9/11, and it was kind of lost in the noise of all that. It was a National Book Award finalist that year. I bought it, held it, and never somehow got around to reading it. And so reading this profile and having just read and enjoyed Manhattan Beach, I thought, well, it's probably time to finally read Look at Me. And I'm really enjoying it. It does feel a bit like a second novel. It's a much bigger novel than The Invisible Circus in terms of taking in social concerns. It's got a very kind of Don DeLillo-esque subplot about terrorism. But on the surface, it is a book that reminded me a lot of Mary Gates-Skill's Veronica. Look at Me and Veronica both have fashion model protagonists. And the premise of Look at Me, it opens with a car crash in Illinois where the protagonist, the heroine, the fashion model, smashes her face into the windshield of her car. And now she's had facial reconstruction surgery. Her skin is unblemished, but she broke like 18 bones in her face. And it suddenly, she's not beautiful anymore. And so it's this premise of, it's a book that, like Mary Gates-Skill's Veronica, which also has a fashion model protagonist, inevitably looks at concepts of beauty,
and Egan was
beauty
a model.
Culture. Oh, did Egan model?
Yes.
So I guess that's probably in the New Yorker profile, but I
write what you know.
I think Gateskill may have modeled as well at one point. And they're both looking at kind of the fashion industry, the modeling industry. They're very different books, though, even if they're on the surface the same. So that's Look at Me. I'm very much enjoying it. It does feel like something that DeLillo might have written were this his world instead.
I'd like to read a DeLillo novel about a fashion model.
That's what he's working on.
You're still with Kate Atkinson this week.
I am. I'm going to be a disappointment to our listeners this week, as I was to myself, because I didn't do a lot of reading. I have a sort of book-related excuse, really a poor one, but very enjoyable, which is that listeners of this podcast know that I don't have TV, but I have DVDs, which I know puts me back into like the last century. And I started watching the miniseries Big Little Lies while exercising. Oh my God, it was so good. I resisted it.
A+ show.
Seriously. Okay. Thank you, Lovia, for the backup here. I resisted it for a long time. I was like, that's not the kind of thing that I would ever watch. But then enough people said you have to watch it. It's really not.
Based on a best-selling novel.
Based on a best-selling novel by Leanne Moriarty. And I don't know how all of this could have gone into the book. I have not read the book, but I highly recommend if you're going to. It's also very good if you like me, exercise while you watch TV, which is my multitasking. It's a really good way of getting in shape quickly because you just can't stop. Every night I was like, I need to exercise and watch Big Little Lies. So it's over. I'm back to Kate Atkinson. We'll probably hear more about it next week. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.